I'm your host, Agnes Brett, and welcome to this week's episode of Climate Bites. Today's episode is about the impact of climate change in the Pacific Islands. We are joined today by two climate scientist experts, Dr. Charlie Slavin.
Hello.
And Dr. Hannah Walker.
Hiya.
We also have local citizen Emma Butterwick.
Hello.
And Ian Fry,
Howdy.
who is the CEO of Island Innovations and co-founder of the Solar Heads of State. And lastly, Amanda.
Hello.
Who is our policy advisor. By 2050, sea level is projected to increase 8 inches along the Pacific. By 2100, it could exceed 2 metres. With thousands of islands in the Pacific being just metres above sea level, the threat of climate change is exacerbating every day, with the threat of these islands being wiped off the map forever. Sea level rise, flooding, drought, wildfires, ocean acidification, tropical storms causing the threat to the livelihood of these island populations and the overall existence of the islands themselves are just the basic threats that climate change is posing. Within the Pacific Island nations, there are 12 countries comprised of around 25,000 islands, covering 30 million square kilometres. Today we will explore and discuss the science behind these impacts and how law enforcers are working to protect the Pacific Island nations and find out what it is really like to live through these uncertain times. So Dr. Charlie, who is our biodiversity expert here with us today, what are some of the issues these islands are facing?
The reduction of biodiversity is one of the issues the Pacific Islands are facing. This is an issue because these islands have one of the greatest biodiversities outside of the tropical jungles, with many of the species found having small ranges and not found in other areas of the world. The largest diversity in this area is found in the coral reefs. Coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, but are home to 25% of the world's biodiversity, supporting more species per unit area than any other marine environment, including 4,000 species of fish and 800 species of hard corals.
Wow, it's clear to see how crucial these ecosystems are in supporting biodiversity. But from a human perspective, what is their significance?
These extremely fragile environments are estimated to have an annual global economic value of between $30 and $300 billion in goods and services, including fisheries, tourism, coastal protection, and the source of medical advances. Because of the coral reef's hard and jagged edges, they can reduce wave power by 93%, showing us that they can be vital in terms of coastal protection. But the warming of the planet has caused the underwater jet streams to slow down, which means that corals in the Pacific are receiving less cool water and becoming nutrient deprived. The increase in carbon in the ocean, due to human changes, is causing its current pH to become more acidic. This acidity means corals struggle to grow their skeletons, making them weaker and much more susceptible to destruction from storms of the seas, which is bad news as climate change is causing far more extreme weather events.
Thank you, Dr. Charlie. That was extremely enlightening, but simultaneously quite frightening. Corals are beautiful, and it'd be such a shame for the world to lose them. So that is one issue that climate change is causing. Another issue I've read and heard about is sea level rise. Dr. Hannah, can you tell us a bit about this and how it's affecting these nations?
Yeah, so overall we know that global mean sea level is rising and the rate of this rise is accelerating. So this is obviously an issue for the Pacific Island nations, as many of them are so extremely low-lying. There's been an overall 0.3 metre rise of sea level in the Pacific Ocean since just 1990. So already you can see how this is going to be an issue for the Pacific Island nations.
Okay, so to a non-scientist, that doesn't sound like a huge amount, but what do I know? Can you explain to us, Dr. Hannah, exactly what that means?
Yeah, of course. So this sea level rise will cause coastal flooding. So this is going to have huge impacts on all of the islands, even the islands which are higher above sea level, because the majority of their population live along the coast, so that's where their infrastructure is, making them vulnerable. So the annual flooding is expected to double or maybe even triple in the next 100 years.
That is crazy. I can't imagine what that must be like to live through. We've learned so far the impact of climate change in the Pacific Islands, but what are the first-hand impacts the locals living here are experiencing? Emma, from a local perspective, what is going on? How are the people feeling about the impact of climate change?
Climate change has ruined our lives. I own a restaurant on the seafront and it's been destroyed by the flooding. It broke all my appliances and furniture so I can no longer open, meaning I had to let my staff go. This was the main source of income for my staff and me. Now we aren't sure how we're going to be able to provide for our families. Even the big resorts are having to shut, which provides jobs to lots of islanders. We may have to move away, leaving our homes behind where we've lived for generations.
Yeah, Emma, that cultural impact of sea level rise is something that isn't often considered. Something else people may not have considered when we talk about the impacts of sea level rise is how this affects freshwater. So as sea level rises and coastal flooding becomes more frequent, seawater may soak into the ground and contaminate the stores of groundwater, leading to freshwater shortages. So the island nation of Tuvalu has already suffered a water emergency in 2011 due to drinking water shortages. So this is having knock-on health impacts with outbreaks of multiple diseases, which is having the most effect on the youth, who are the main source of income for so many families.
Wow, so sea level rise affects freshwater. I had never considered that. So moving on, Amanda, what impact is climate change having on international relationships?
The Pacific Island nations are most at risk of feeling the repercussions of climate change caused by larger nations such as Australia, who have been slow to react and take responsibility for their actions. This has caused a strain on the relationship between these countries, with jokes made by Australian politicians when Pacific nations asked for help with sea level rise problem. Any help offered was undermined by the current Labour Party supporting a fossil fuel project which will emit 1.4 billion tons of greenhouse gases. Billion, with a B.
I mean, I remember seeing those comments in the news from the Australian politicians, and I was just flabbergasted. So, moving on, in terms of mitigating climate change, Ian, your work is focusing on this. How will this reduce some of the impacts of climate change we've just discussed? Can you tell us a bit more about it?
So my interest is primarily implementing and funding installation of renewable resources. I mainly do my work through the company Solar Heads of State, and it's used in delivering solar panels to nations of Fiji, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and others. The inaction of global governments means that these small islands, or SIDS, are forced to fund their adaptation themselves, despite having little to no impact on global carbon emissions. It is something I try to address with my company and my network, linking to the COP27 Climate Summit, which highlighted the Pacific Island nations calling for a treaty to reduce fossil fuel production and focus on more renewable energy, such as solar.
That's extremely interesting, Ian. So we've discussed some of the issues that are present in the Pacific Islands. What can we do to mitigate and protect against these issues?
So, in terms of sea level rise, simply put, there are 4 management options. So, one option being building hard protection, such as seawalls. Another is ecosystem-based adaptation, like protecting mangroves and barrier beaches. Another is accommodation, through accepting that flood events are going to happen, so flood-proofing buildings. And lastly, retreat, so relocating and moving further inland away from the coast. So all of these options have pros and cons, and likely adaptation will look like a combination of all 4. We can't really generalize here. These adaptation methods will have to be very location specific.
Okay, so Emma, what is the local community doing in your area to contribute to mitigating the effects of climate change and to work towards being more resilient?
So we have lots of different projects across the islands to help people adapt to climate change. One of them being a youth employment group in Tolga, which is helping young people find jobs and provide for their families. I'm also part of another project which helps women in climate change, as women are most at risk due to the gender-specific roles in a household, meaning we are more likely to get diseases. The group helps women work together to become more resilient, teaching each other what to have in an emergency bag in case of a natural disaster. We also have an information warning system across the island so we can alert one another if something happens, and provides a safe space where we can talk about our challenges and support each other.
That is so encouraging to hear that women are coming together to help each other and get through these difficult times. So what policies are currently in place to help tackle this issue?
Currently in Fiji, their climate change policy has 36 projects going on and 14 pieces of legislation to reduce the impact of climate change. These projects and policies include things to facilitate development of marine industries to become more sustainable and reduce harm to marine environments. Also, Australia has pledged to spend $700 million over 5 years to strengthen resilience to climate change in the Pacific and to mend their relationship with the Pacific Island nations.
That's really good to hear. So looking forward to the future, what can we expect?
So, in the future, sea level rise is going to continue with increased warming. The extent of this rise will depend on which emission scenarios followed, but the change will probably be somewhere between 40 and 80 centimetre rise by 2100. And sea level rise is not going to stop rising beyond 2100, even if we drastically reduce our impacts on the climate.
Yes, and on top of that, if the planet warms by 1.5 degrees, 99% of the world's coral will be exposed to heat waves that may be too frequent to recover from, resulting in a 70 to 90% decrease in living coral around the planet.
One thing that could curtail the damage to corals is proper conservation of island habitats, something my company, Island Innovation, has been supporting by linking policymakers and island nations to organizations. One thing we cannot do is hastily resort to solutions that ignore the biodiversity and cultural heritage of these island states. One instance being the Maldives, where large development projects are resorting to dredging, which endangers corals and the biodiversity of the island. Dredging is an endeavor many islands are resorting to across the world, but it should be avoided for the health of our fragile coral reefs.
Well, I certainly have learnt a lot today, and I'm sure you listeners have too. We have discussed sea level rise, reduction in biodiversity, and how this is impacting the community, as well as learning about new technologies and how policies are being created to tackle climate change. There is still hope for the future, with COP27 talks still ongoing where people in power can make decisions towards helping these nations who are vulnerable. But going forwards, at home, what can you listeners do? Well, I'm sure to lots of you, the Pacific Islands are pretty far away, but there are still things you can do to reduce the impact of climate change. So changing your lifestyle is the way you can make a difference. This can include things like reducing your carbon footprint by walking places and getting public transport. By changing your consumption through buying more sustainably sourced goods, this can also aid in reducing your carbon footprint. Thank you for listening to Climate Bite. You can find out more information on Climate Bite website.